All right, folks, we'll get started a couple minutes early here. Just want to make a few quick announcements. Folks who might have missed, sort of not quite on yet, they can catch up because we'll be recording this all. I'm not recording. Okay, cool. Some things to remember. Big thing on the horizon is that our first quiz is going to be on Wednesday. Okay, so our next class period, you got to make sure that you're squared away in terms of having a reliable internet connection because we're going to have our quiz from 11 to 11:50. Normally, when we would normally do class, that's all we're going to do. So at that time, that quiz will be open. And so what you need to do is get on there and go through, take that quiz. It'll be 40 multiple choice questions. Run through that, and that's all we're going to do next Wednesday. Okay, I'll get those scored up to you, so to let you know where we're at in terms of performance on that, and then we'll pick up Friday with the next section. Okay, so in terms of getting prepped for that, Samantha, is Samantha here anywhere? Samantha's not on yet. Okay, Samantha's going to have an SI session this evening, I believe. She'll go through and send out a notification on that. So again, make sure that you can attend if you're able to make that work with your schedule. I will go through tomorrow. I think I was looking at that. We'll probably do it at 5, just so I'm not keeping you all sort of in psych stuff late into the evening. But at 5 tomorrow, what I'll do is I'll have a review session. Again, I'm not going to bring any material, but you all come in. Bring questions, anything that you want me to go through, give additional examples, all that stuff. I'll go through that and make sure that we're all on the same page with stuff. If you can't make it, we'll record that. If you can't make it and you want me to cover questions, email those to me. I'll make sure to get those taken care of in the review section or in the review session, just so we have everything squared away with stuff. Okay. Any questions on any of that stuff before we jump into material today? Feeling good? All right, you guys are looking good. All right, cool. So let's jump in to where we finished up last time. Can someone just give me a quick shout out to make sure my computer's working, the audio on mine? Okay, yep, cool, I can hear you guys. Like asking you for questions and my sound's not working, so people ask me questions, I'm charging along. Okay, cool. So we finished up last time talking about psychological theory. What qualifies as a good psychological theory? Just because I have a theory doesn't mean that it's a good theory. But our theory, again, is just our explanation for how something works. And hopefully what we're able to do with that theory, it hopefully covers all of the stuff that we're interested in doing, all aspects of whatever phenomena it is that we're studying. Hopefully this theory is going to give us testable predictions that we can go through and empirically evaluate evidence for or against, and our theory should provide us a basis for that operational definition. Remember that this operational definition is telling us for this study, for how we're doing stuff, how do we know when something occurs, how do we measure it, and things along those lines. Okay, so what we do then is once we've got our theory, once we've got our hypotheses, we're going to approach this with our scientific method. Again, this is our tool for trying to understand things about human behavior in an objective, ordered way. Okay, so first thing we're going to do with our scientific method is we're going to identify a problem in a research question. What do I want to study? What is the problem or the issue that I want to know more about? Right? What I'm wanting to know is what factors influence depression or PTSD, or what is the impact of personality on behavior or something along those lines. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to develop, so to get a specific research question, and then I'm going to go through and I'm going to see what's been done before. Again, this is this cumulative nature of science. I'm just not going to jump in the middle of stuff with my own ideas. What I need to be doing is going through, seeing what people have done before, what's worked, what hasn't, and that's going to help me hone in on a good study. Okay. Then I'm going to formulate a hypothesis. Okay, hypothesis is different than a theory. Theory is overall sort of what's going on. How do we understand sort of what's my guess on how all this stuff works? Hypothesis is specific. Hypothesis is for my study. If I do this, if I have this group versus that group, this group's going to be bigger than the other group, or this thing's going to be stronger in this group. A hypothesis is an informed, testable prediction, something that's very specific. In my data, I'm expecting this to look this way. Okay, so sometimes people get the theory and the hypothesis mixed up. The theory is kind of the overall story. The hypothesis is the specific prediction of what's going to happen in your study. Okay. Then what we're going to do is we're going to put together some sort of method. We're going to talk about a couple of different methods, broad category of methods that are used to test these hypotheses, right? And what we want to make sure, again, going back to the last slide, is that we have strong operational definitions of sort of whatever it is that we're looking at, right? So let's say I'm interested in depression. And I say, oh, I'm going to expect depression to be sort of bigger in this group or that. So this group to have more severe depression than the other group. Well, what I need to do is for my study, what is depression for the context of my study? How am I going to measure this, right? And that starts to get very important, because if I'm reviewing your study, I might say, well, your measure of depression, you just asked people how sad they were. Depression's a lot more than that. You didn't actually measure depression. Your operational definition of depression is no good for this study, and then we can't tell anything from it, right? So again, these operational definitions for the purpose of this study, how am I going to measure it and quantify it, starts to become very important. Then we're going to go through, we're going to collect our data, we're going to analyze that data, and then we're going to draw conclusions. Were my predictions supported? Did I find evidence? Is my data consistent with what I had expected? If it is, then I'm saying, hooray, I'm excited about that. But oftentimes, probably more often than not, our hypotheses aren't supported. Something different happened, right? And so then what we need to do is we need to figure out what went wrong. Was I just wrong in my hypotheses? Did I just make the wrong prediction? Did I make the right prediction? And that's actually sort of how things work. It's just my study didn't capture sort of what it was that I was trying to get at, right? If I have no support for my hypotheses, and this is a central portion of my theory, maybe I need to go back through and rethink about how all this stuff works, right? And so then what we need to do then is kind of take stock, see what went well, see what didn't, and then we need to replicate, okay? One study in and of itself is functionally meaningless. It can suggest certain things, but what we want to see is something that happens again and again and again and again and again. And this is a hard thing with research, right? You'll see something on the media, or something pops up in the news like, study finds X. Well, fine, maybe study finds X. But what I would want to see before I start to have confidence in that as a thing, I would want to see this studies repeatedly find the same thing in kind of the general same magnitude before I can start to have confidence that this is actually something that might explain how things fit together. Okay, and so this is our scientific method. It's iterative, it's collaborative, it's going over and over and over again. We can get excited about one study, but we should never be too excited about one study. One study is just one point of evidence towards some hypotheses that we have. Okay. Questions about our scientific method? Cool. All right. So types of research. We can go about research in a lot of different ways. And depending on what our purpose or what we're trying to do, the methods that we might use start to look a little bit different. Okay. So if we're thinking about Jacob, you're at the top of my screen right now, so I'm going to use you as an example. So Jacob is interested in a new area of research that no one has ever looked at before. You have a novel question. No one's actually systematically looked at this thing. If that's where we're starting, what we might want to start out is with a descriptive study. Descriptive studies are used to just start to gain some insight, start to generate ideas about how some phenomena works, and start to get some just basic data together for continued study down the road. Okay, so you can think about your descriptive research as kind of very, very sort of first stages types of things. Okay, and our descriptive research can start to look like take a number of different forms. First type of descriptive research is going to be the case study. Okay, and when we're looking at a case study, this is an in-depth evaluation of one single individual, and it's this one single individual is often a person or a case that's very, very unique, perhaps very rare, and very, very meaningful for some reason. Now, I've got a graphic up here. Can someone tell me what this graphic represents or who this is here?
Skull of Phineas Gage.
That is the skull of Phineas Gage. Daniel, was that you? Yeah. Can you tell us what's going on? What happened to Phineas Gage?
Phineas Gage was a railroad worker who, very temperate, normal man who, one day after a spiking accident, a railroad spike went up through the bottom of his head and came out the other end. He survived it and was taken to recover, and they had found out that his frontal lobe had been, destroyed from the accident, and it completely changed his personality.
Yeah, perfect. Daniel, sorry, that was Michael talking. I sort of got us switched around. But, Michael, you're absolutely right, okay? This is in the 1800s, I think. Railroad worker, horrible accident, explosion, had a bar, fired up through his head. Like, you can see here, it's going through the bottom of his cheek and up through the top of his head. That should kill a person. That 99.999% of the time kills a person, but it didn't kill Phineas Gage, right? And people were shocked, right? But what they found was that, as Michael said beforehand, this guy was a pretty easygoing guy, pretty sort of laid back, sort of temperate guy. After this injury, really erratic, really unpredictable. And what they've done in terms of going through and studying, because how many people are like, I want a sample of 100 people who've had bars stuffed through their head and didn't die. That's not going to be a thing that we can find, right? This is one specific, unique case. And what they found, or suggested, and I hypothesized, and it's probably correct, is that when that bar went through his brain, it damaged certain parts of the brain that are important for regulation and sort of making sure that sort of right now, if you want to yell at your roommate and slap him, that you're not going to do that because that's not an appropriate thing. You might want to. You might feel like doing that, but we don't do it because these frontal lobe sections are keeping us under control. But Phineas Gage had that all blown out, and so now all of a sudden, much less ability to go through regulate emotion and behavior. And so this is a good example of a case study where we find some person that's unique in some way and doing just an in-depth sort of a information gathering on that one single individual to try and learn something about a phenomenon. Okay? So our case study is going to be a little bit different than our naturalistic observation. Naturalistic observation, still descriptive research, but what we're doing here is we're going out and we're observing, recording some behavior as it's occurring in sort of the natural environment. Okay? Unlike the case study, we're probably observing a great number of individuals, and these individuals are probably not extraordinary in any way. I mean, everybody's unique and special, but not sort of this person is individual. There's no one like this person ever. We're just going out and kind of watching groups, okay? So, for example, if you wanted to do a naturalistic study, and let's say you if we weren't in the middle of a pandemic, and there were people in and out of the union, maybe you sit on the side and just kind of watch how maybe new freshman students, many of you are freshmen, and maybe we got a researcher who's interested in how people come together and start to organize into groups and things along those lines. And so what that researcher might do is just kind of sit sort of away on the edge of the union and just kind of observe and watch how people interact. Okay, Jane Goodall, sort of the graphic we have here, excellent example of naturalistic study. Now, do we have any anthropology majors? Okay. Goodall's research is sometimes controversial in some ways, the extent to which she interacted with chimps or didn't interact with chimps. People in this area will start to have strong opinions about this. But in general, this idea of going into the forest and just watching sort of these chimps taking observations and then starting to draw some conclusions or ideas about how these animals or the social structure and things along these lines, a good example of naturalistic observation. Naturalistic observation, I'm not getting involved. I'm not touching anything. I'm not sort of in the works doing anything. I'm just watching behavior as it naturally occurs. So we got naturalistic observation, and then we have qualitative interviews. Okay, qualitative interviews are gonna be, let's say I'm interested in, again, let's say I'm a freshman at the University of Wyoming, right? So we've got folks coming in from a lot of different areas, and what we want to do is understand something about their experiences coming onto campus, or maybe it's their experience sort of coming onto campus with COVID or something like that. And so what we do is we get a handful of people, not just one, right? But maybe, a handful of folks to come in, and we just go through and do some interviews, some structured, unstructured interviews. And what we want to do is just want to get insight into their behavior, their experience, things along those lines. Okay. So these individuals may not be really unique, exceptional individuals like the case study, and there's going to be more of them, right? But what we are doing is we're asking questions, we're interacting, so it's different than the naturalistic observation. Naturalistic observation, hands off, I'm just watching, right? The qualitative interviews, we're bringing people in, just trying to get an idea for what whoever I'm interested, what the experience of these individuals is like. Okay. So again, all of these are forms of descriptive research. We think about this as kind of entry-level research just to go through and try and get an understanding of sort of some phenomenon. Okay. Questions about this? All right. So descriptive research, very, very good at starting to develop hypotheses and sort of trying to get a sense for how things work together, and maybe starting to get an idea of what types of questions are going to be interesting to ask in this area, but clear potential for bias. Why might we have a potential for bias with descriptive research?
You might be focused on some parts and not be focused on other parts.
Yeah, exactly. Who do we have there? Cade. All right. Yeah. So yeah, you're exactly right, Cade. What we can have is, again, remember that those biases that we've talked about before, right? Like if I'm wanting to see something, if I'm expecting something to happen, I might be more likely to pick up on that stuff and ignore things that are not consistent with my hypotheses, right? So maybe I come in and I think that, freshmen are going to be really, really 100% unhappy. Everybody's going to be mad that everything's online. There's no in-person classes. And so there's certainly going to be students who feel that way. And I'm going to focus on those and maybe not ignore or not pay as much attention to the people who are like, I don't know, I kind of like this online thing. That kind of works out for me, right? And so we have potential for confirmation bias with our descriptive research because it can't be objective the way some of our other stuff can. And then again, it's exploratory. If I go through and I run interviews with a small collection of people who I'm able to get, it's possible that those people aren't representative of the larger student body, right? So I get, 5 or 10 freshmen who respond to my call for participation, and they come in, we talk, but it turns out that those folks just have really strong opinions, maybe in one way, and they're not representative of everybody. And so we have to be careful for descriptive research, recognizing that we do have a potential for bias, seeing what we want to see. And then, again, it's a nice way to start to develop ideas to then be later tested down the road. Okay. All right. So next step up. So maybe we've done some descriptive research and we've sort of generated some ideas about how phenomena act together. What we might do then is transition into some correlational research. Okay, correlational research, we're looking at and using some statistical techniques to look at an association between two different variables. Okay, and then when I'm talking about a variable, I'm saying a variable is any characteristic or anything that differs across individuals. Someone give me an example of a variable.
Eye color.
Eye color. Perfect. Eye color is a variable. Not everybody has the same eye color, so eye color is a variable. What else is a variable?
Height.
What's that? Height is a variable, right? So basically, this is an easy question because basically anything that you say is going to be a variable, right? It's just anything that differs across individuals. And what we want to do with our correlational research is look at, say, what is the question between variable X and variable Y? Okay. And the way we do it is in a very basic way to start to look at the strength and the direction of an association is calculate a correlation between two measures. And our correlation is just telling us the extent to which as X changes, how does Y change, right? And what we do is we reduce this down to a single correlation coefficient, R here. And this R coefficient gives us the strength and the direction of a relationship. Okay, correlations range from -1 to 1, and then the sign tells us what direction that we're going in. Okay, so as our correlation starts to get closer to 1 or -1, it starts to indicate a much stronger association. As our correlations get closer and closer to 0, suggests a much weaker correlation. Okay. And so what we can do is we can calculate our correlation, and that's going to be our statistic, our coefficient right here. But we can often represent these data as a scatter plot. Okay, and this is a nice way to look at some of these correlational data. Okay, so for an example, all right, on the left panel here, what kind of correlation do we have?
Positive.
Yeah, a positive correlation. And what specifically is our correlation coefficient here? Probably
about 1.
Probably about 1. Exactly. If I know what X is, I know what the score on Y is. This is a perfect straight line. X perfectly predicts Y. I have a correlation of +1 here. What about the right panel here? What's my correlation look like to be here, maybe?
Close to 0.
Yeah, close to 0. Yeah, what do you say that, Hannah?
There's not really a pattern. There's nothing about a value of X that could predict Y or vice versa.
Oh, beautiful. I give you a high five. I'll give you a virtual high five right now because you're exactly right. There's nothing about X that tells me anything about Y. I've just got a big cloud going on here, right? So I would expect a correlation coefficient here of about 0. Okay. What about this? All right, so this is a correlation between quiz 1 grades and final grades from past semesters. What am I seeing here?
We're still seeing a positive correlation, but it's just not as strong.
Yeah, perfect, Michael. Positive correlation. I'm seeing a trend. So as things go up, right, as X increases, Y increases, and that's telling me that I've got a positive correlation here. But it's not perfect, right? There's a lot of variability. If I know something about your quiz 1 score, I can probably predict around so that where things are going to end up, but it's not a perfect correlation. Okay. And then, so if we can also have negative correlations. Negative correlations are going to go instead of as X goes, here, let me see, I'm trying to, X goes up, Y goes up like this. Negative correlation, same thing, it's just going to go down. As X increases, Y decreases. Can someone give me a correlation? What would be an example of a negative correlation?
Exercise and depression.
Yeah, that would be good. Nice work, Colin. Yeah. And why is that a negative correlation?
People who consistently exercise tend to correlate with being less depressed in their daily life.
Yeah, perfect. So if the more I exercise, right, and this is sort of me sitting in here sort of quite out of shape, but we know that just sort of getting out and doing things. So if I would expect maybe a weak correlation, not super strong, but as my, say, hours of weekly exercise increase, my symptoms of depression decrease. And so I might get, say, a negative correlation of 0.2 or something like that. And that negative sign, the 0.2 says there's a relationship there. Maybe it's not super strong, but as my one thing increases, my other thing decreases. Okay. So again, our correlation is giving us an index of the magnitude or the strength and the direction of that association. Now, some strengths of our correlational research, much more objective than our descriptive research. Okay, so we're calculating measurements, we're using statistics and things along those lines, but main limitations of our correlation research is we're not able to establish causal relationships between variables. Okay, and this is a huge, huge thing where people will start to get turned around. I pulled a headline, and this was from way back when I first started teaching, but it was a headline in CNN, and the headline says, when mom earns more, it's tough on dad, right? And so the story had an anecdote about Mina and Rich, about Samantha and Andre, and the sort of meat of the article was a study of 200,000 men conducted by Washington University found that men whose wives are primary earners are 10% more likely to require medication for mental health conditions, including insomnia, anxiety, and erectile dysfunction. Okay? So, the question is, again, the headline, when a mom earns more, it's tough on dad. Based on this study, this correlational study, do we assume, is the conclusion that working women cause impotence in men? Is that what we take away from this study?
I mean, I think that's kind of what the beginning headline kind of they're like pointing people to, but I mean, like you said, there's not really a way to show the causation of one to the other. It could be like a confounding variable. Yeah,
Michael, can you say a little bit more about what might be actually? So we're seeing a correlation between sort of as women become the primary breadwinner. Or exist as a primary breadwinner in the home, we're seeing higher rates of sort of mental health and medication use among the men. What might be driving that association?
Social norms.
Okay, some.
Maybe they had problems before, and that's why the women are.
Okay, yeah, Olivia, that's what I would be willing to wager a large sum of money is what's driving this, right? So what we've got, so the story is trying to sort of hint at this idea that, boy, what we've got going on is we've got evidence that as women start to take over and become the breadwinners and sort of wear the pants in the home, that for us dudes it's hard because that's a flip of a gender role, and now I'm sort of questioning and feeling inferior, and I'm not the man of the house and the breadwinner and things along those lines. Maybe, right? But being a clinical psychologist, what I think is probably more likely, exactly what Olivia said, right? We know that mental health difficulties with anxiety, depression, and sort of the stuff that comes along those lines, one of the reasons this is problematic is functional impairment in employment, right? If I'm depressed, if I can't get out of bed, or I'm having panic attacks right, left, and center, it's hard for me to hold down jobs. And so if I'm struggling to maintain employment, or I'm underemployed, then maybe my partner has to be the person who comes in and ends up as actually the person making more money in the home, right? We actually can't know sort of one way or the other based on this because it's only given us a correlation, right? But the thing that we always need to be careful about when we're hearing about research or looking at stuff is that our correlational research is not causal. We can't assume that X causes Y just because there's association. There's going to be third variables. There's going to be lots of other explanations. And so we want to be careful with that. Okay. So our correlational research, more objective, but still some limitations here. Okay. All right. Last type of design that we're going to talk about is our experimental design. Okay. Our experimental research is a situation where we as investigators are actively manipulating or changing some feature or some variable in order to see if we have an impact on outcome. Okay, and again, this experimental manipulation, this is the defining feature of an experiment. If you, the investigator, didn't go through and actively change something in this, then it's not an experiment. It's probably just correlational stuff. Okay. And so with our experimental research, what we're interested in is a population. This is all the people, hypothetically, who we would be interested in. And sometimes if it's psychology research, it's all people, all humans, right? So our population of interest that we want to infer something about is all humans. Can we include all humans in our study? No, we can't. So what we can do is we can get a sample of humans. So here are my sample of humans that I couldn't get. So, or let's say my population is all residents of the United States. Can I get all residents of the United States in my study? Nope. So, but I can go through and I can draw a sample. Okay. And hopefully that sample is representative. Hopefully that's a random sample that's representative of sort of the people I'm actually interested in. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that sample for an experimental study, and I'm going to sort of divide these folks, my sample, into an experimental group and a control group. Okay. And this independent variable is the factor that I'm manipulating. So let's say I've got a treatment. I'm doing a study on treatment for PTSD. And so I've got an experimental group that's getting an active treatment. And I've got a control group, and these folks are just kind of hanging out, or never mind. Let's not say, let's go back. Let's, just to make this easier, let's say I've got a study and I'm looking at treatment for COVID. Okay, let's do that. And let's say I've got an active treatment, and my experimental group is getting my active treatment for COVID. My control group, this is the folks who are getting some sort of placebo. They're getting a pill, but there's actually nothing in there. It's just a sugar pill. It's an inert subject or substance. Okay. Now the thing is, which makes this whole experiment thing work, is random assignment to the experiment group or the control group. Someone tell me why random assignment is crucial for a good experiment.
It helps eliminate confounding variables.
Yeah, Jordan, you're exactly right. Say a little bit more about that. How does random assignment help us control for confounding variables?
Well, you could say blood type in the COVID treatment. Maybe one blood type receives it a little bit better, and so you got random.
Yeah. Let's say there's something about my medication that interacts with blood type that changes the way this intervention works. If everybody in my experiment group has blood type B, and that's what sort of interacts well, and everybody else doesn't, now all of a sudden my stuff's off, right? Because I've got a confounding variable. If I randomly assign, if everybody, so let's say I've got a sample of 100 people, and I randomly assign people to the experimental group and the control group, I am assuming that whatever differences may exist in those groups is kind of spread out evenly across my two conditions, right? If not, let's say I only put, let's say I'm running a psychology study. I've got a treatment, right? And I only put the people who are really excited about my psychotherapy treatment in the experimental group, and the people who are less excited about it get put in the control group. And I find, lo and behold, that my therapy works. What's the problem with my conclusion there if I haven't randomly assigned people to condition?
People of the group that you're psychoanalyzing want it to work more than the other group.
Yeah, crushed it. Exactly. The people who I systematically funneled into my treatment group are the people who wanted to work, who were maybe more motivated to be in there. And so it screwed everything up, right? What I need to do is I need to bring people in and say, hey, here's a study. We're going to do some stuff. You're going to get randomized to this group or that group. That's completely random, to try and help sort of tease apart some of those potential confounds. Okay. So go through, get our random assignment, our independent variable. This is the factor we're manipulating. This is treatment group. This is treatment or something else, right? Switching that up. And then what we're going to do, once we've separated people, we're going to implement that experimental manipulation, and then we're going to measure some outcome. This is our dependent variable, okay? In our sort of COVID example, maybe it's symptoms, or sort of whether or not people have COVID, or severity of illness or something along those lines. And what we're going to do is we're then going to see, do these groups differ? Are there differences in outcome? And why this design is so strong is because I went through and I determined who was in each group. As the experimenter, I randomly assigned people to the experimental group or the control group. So before I institute my experimental manipulation, should I see differences in the experimental group and the control group on the front end? Nope. Those folks should be about the same because I've randomized them. There shouldn't be any differences, right? But once we've done through and gone through the experiment, completed the experimental manipulation, whatever the treatment or task was, if I see differences here on the back end, what am I assuming? What's the strength of my experimental study relative to my correlational study?
Your experimental study should be able to show causation in some sense.
Yeah, you're exactly right. With the hopefully right now, causation is a tricky thing, and so there's a lot of stuff that goes into it. But the idea, instead of just observing something, right, in our correlational research and say these two things are sort of related to one another, my hope is because I'm the one who's determined who is in the experimental group and who is in the control group, and before we do anything, those two groups shouldn't be different. But after we do the experiment, now they are different. I'm assuming that whatever it was I did on the front end is something that caused sort of the differences that's going on here. Michael, did you have anything else to add, or we're going to say anything else to that?
Oh, no, that's pretty much what I was going to say.
Okay, cool. All right. So this study, these types of studies are tough. And so I want to go through a couple of examples that's trying to solidify this for folks. So let's say my question is whether or not breastfeeding kids impacts IQ. Okay. So what I do is I get a sample of mothers who have newborns. And so what we're going to do is we're going to randomize these newborns and mothers into two different groups, an experimental group and a control group. Experimental group, we're having those mothers breastfeed. The control group, this is going to be a group of mothers just getting normal pediatric care, sort of feeding with formula and things like that. Okay, so we switch them into two groups, try and make sure that hopefully they're breastfeeding or using formula as they're supposed to, and then 6 years down the road, we assess IQ of the children at, say, age 6. Okay, in this study, what is my independent variable? Yeah, milk or breastfeeding, right? Sort of the formula, sort of milk, sort of feeding type, breastfeeding versus formula. What's my dependent variable? Yeah, IQ, intelligence level, sort of down the road, okay? And the idea is, if these kids, right at birth, my two groups aren't systematically different, because I randomized them to the two different groups, right? Hopefully what I can do is I can start to infer something causal about the impact of breast milk on IQ down the road, okay? Let's take another example. Let's say I'm an alcohol researcher, and I'm interested, my question is, does alcohol use increase perceptions of attractiveness? Okay, and so what I do is I bring in a bunch of students, okay, and I randomize these. I got again, say 50 students, and I go through and I randomize half the students to get actual alcohol, let's say 2 or 3 standard drinks, and then the other group gets some sort of placebo. They get something that tastes like alcohol, but really isn't alcohol. All right. And then what I go through and I do is I show them a series of pictures and have them rate the attractiveness of targets in those pictures. And then on the outcome, I see whether or not my folks who got actual alcohol are rating people as systematically more attractive than my folks who had the placebo, something that tasted like alcohol but really wasn't alcohol. Okay. In this situation, what's my dependent variable? Yeah. Ratings of attractiveness, right? That's my outcome. What's my independent variable? Alcohol use, right? And so what I've done is I've split these people up into different groups and then looked at the outcome. Why did I have in my control group, why did I give those folks something that tasted like alcohol but really wasn't alcohol? Why didn't I just have them drink water or just not have anything and just sort of rate attractiveness of folks?
Would it be because of no and then that would change it?
What's that, Trenton?
Would it be that if that were the case, they would know what's happening and would end up changing the
Yeah. So people will know. Heather, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I was going to say that when you give people a placebo, like saying, "Oh, this is alcohol," even if it isn't, they will generally act like they've had alcohol, just because the mindset of things like that.
Yeah. What we want to do is we want to. You're both right on track. We want to try and control for expectations, right? If I think I'm drunk and I'm acting like I think how drunk people act, I might not be doing it intentionally, but it's something in there that's starting to impact my results. And so what we want to do with this placebo, right? Same thing with drug studies. It's nice. So you either get a real medication or something that's an inert substance. What I want to make sure is that this active medication is doing something above and beyond just creating expectancy effects among individuals. Okay. So this is our experimental study. And again, the defining feature of an experiment is this manipulation. As a researcher, I'm doing something to change things. Okay. Now, limitations of my experimental studies, placebo effects are something that we're trying to account for. This is pretty easy to account for in like med research, but sometimes not, right? Sometimes my meds have some pretty noticeable side effects. And if I'm in the med condition and I'm getting nausea or dizziness or something along those lines, I've probably got a pretty good idea that I'm actively getting something, right? So it can start to become tricky. Psychotherapy research is also tricky. How do I create a placebo of psychotherapy? How do I have something that's 100% inert that you think is actually treatment, but it's not actually treatment? I don't know what that is. And no one knows what that is because it's hard, right? So sometimes we get these placebo effects, these expectations that are difficult to deal with in some of these studies. We also have concerns with external validity. This is the same thing as the ecological validity issue we talked about before with the structuralists, right? And again, speaking from my area, from clinical psychology, people will say, well, fine, if I go through and I get a very specific subset of individuals with, say, post-traumatic stress disorder, and I exclude anybody that has comorbid depression or alcohol use, and they have to be able to come into treatment, and they have to be willing to sit on the wait list, and then they have to be in this area, and sort of all these restrictions, it makes for a nice, tight experiment. But what my concern is maybe this treatment that I provide in my lab for a very specific group of individuals, those effects don't generalize to anybody out there in the world. If I'm a therapist out in the universe, I'm like, well, that's cool that you did that in your lab, but this isn't something that you didn't run this with the people that I'm seeing coming through my doors, and you didn't do it in a way that's actually transportable out in the real world. And so we have a concern with external validity, right? Did I just do something that's kind of a parlor trick in my lab that actually doesn't generalize out to the real world? And this is the tricky thing. Our experimental studies are kind of our gold standard, but not without limitations.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
I was wondering if the Stanford prison experiment would be an example of this.
Yeah. Stanford prison experiment is a definite experiment. Betsy, we're going to talk about that sort of later on in the semester and start to talk into, thanks, and you're just setting up home runs for me here in a couple slides. We're going to finish up with talking about ethics and sort of huge issues going on with that. But you're exactly right. All right. So I'm going to touch real quick on how we analyze our data. Okay. What we need to do is have some sort of approach to try and determine whether or not differences that we're seeing between our variables and across our groups are meaningful and reliable. Okay. So let's say that my hypothesis is that out there in the universe, all of you, that everyone with blonde hair or everyone with dark hair is taller than everyone with blonde hair. I'm not sure why I have this hypothesis. It's just the hypothesis that I have, right? And so what we do is we go through and we measure height in inches, everybody with dark hair, height in inches of everybody with blonde hair. And I find, lo and behold, that folks with dark hair are 3/4 of an inch taller than folks with blonde hair. And I say, hypothesis confirmed. Sweet. People with dark hair are innately taller than people with blonde hair. What's wrong with that assumption or that interpretation? That might not be true of everyone, but just on average. I'm like, yeah, not everybody, but just on average.
Representative enough of bigger population.
Yeah, what I don't know is that's actually sort of a meaningful or reliable difference, right? If I were to run that study again, I could find the exact opposite thing, and and then we keep doing it over back and forth, right? So what we want to do is we want to have some sort of method for determining whether or not the difference that I'm seeing is big enough to interpret as basically something that's real, okay? Always two possible explanations for our data. One, what we're seeing, the differences that we're seeing or the association we're seeing is a real meaningful relationship, or this is just random, right? It just happened. Like one group's got to be taller than the other every single time. They're never going to be exactly the same. Are the differences that I'm seeing, are they replicable? Is it something that I can sort of say, yes, this is reflective of my larger groups? And so what we will use is inferential statistics. This is our, if anybody eventually end up taking statistics courses, this is the type of thing you'll do there, using some different types of tests to try and help tease things apart in terms of which group is are the differences that we're seeing. Do we have confidence that this reflects some real and meaningful pattern? We're just going to touch on just a couple sort of basic descriptive statistics. One's going to be our measure of central tendency. This is going to be what score is in the middle, what score is most representative of my group, right? So and this is often going to be your average, right? Some sort of your mean. So if I have IQ scores here, here's my measure of central tendency. This score of 100 is the most representative score of people in my sample. We're also going to have variability. Variability is how spread out our scores are. So I know, on average, the average IQ score in, so to say, the U.S. population is 100, because it has to be, because that's how things are scaled. But not everybody has an IQ of 100. People are going to have IQs sort of that spread out sort of all over the place, right? And so my measure of variability is how spread out are those scores. On average, how much do those scores deviate from that mean or that middle value? And this is our sort of measure of variability, how much things sort of jump around. So central tendency is the middle. Variability is on average how different our scores, right? So if I were to, say, take the average age of everybody in the class today, is that going to be something that has a lot of variability or not a lot of variability?
Probably not a lot.
Probably not a lot of variability. I'm assuming that most of you are somewhere in that 18 to 22, 23 range. Now, there's going to be obviously some people could be younger, some people could be older, but for the most part, it's going to be pretty, everybody's going to be pretty consistent. What if we were to weigh everybody in class and take a look at sort of mass? Would we see a lot of variability there or not a lot of variability? Lots of variability, right? We got different people of different sizes, shapes, mass, sort of men, women, lot more variability in terms of that, right? So this is just kind of what we're thinking about in terms of some of these basic statistics. All right. Last thing we're going to close up on here, research ethics, okay? So we're talking a lot about how we're going about doing things, but we always have to be thinking about making sure that people are respected and protected in our research. And one of the foundational documents that starts to formalize an ethical code for psychological research, biomedical research, is the Belmont Report in 1978. Okay, this was a government document put together by committees to start to establish some rules for how we go about doing research. Okay, ideas on what different events that led to the need to formalize research ethics into some sort of formal code.
Psychological study that was scaring a baby.
That was getting at what, Court?
Was scaring a bit like an infant. His name was Albert.
Oh yeah. Little Albert's research. Little Albert research wasn't sort of one of the primary motivators, but it is an example of why we need this type of stuff. Yeah. Well, at the end of World War II, when we started to hear about atrocities conducted by Nazi scientists and some of the experiments they were forcing on individuals, people were horrified, right? But we also had things going on in the U.S. That when it came out was very, very concerning to people. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment, or this Tuskegee syphilis study, what government health officials did with this study from 1932 to 1972. The idea was, or the goal was, to look at the natural trajectory of untreated syphilis. And so what researchers did is they went into the rural South, rural Alabama, and they got a number of black sharecroppers. And they told these individuals, what we're going to do is we're going to give you free health care, right? So they lied to them. They said, we're going to give you free health care. But what they found is about 2/3 of these individuals had syphilis. And so what they did under the guise of free health care is had folks come in and monitor, and they weren't providing them health care. What they were doing is looking at the effects as syphilis become more and more advanced. Syphilis is a serious deal. It can cause death if left untreated. And so what scientists were doing is they're watching these individuals succumb to syphilis by telling them they're giving them free health care. And then once there was a cure for syphilis, they could treat syphilis, actively withheld these individuals, prevented them from getting treatment for syphilis, because if they would have got treated for syphilis, then I can't see what happens to if syphilis goes on and on, right? Never told they had the disease, and actively thwarted from getting treatment, okay? When this came out, people were shocked, people were outraged, and rightly so, okay? We hit time. For those of you who need to split out for something else, go ahead and do this. You can catch the last couple of minutes of this on the recording if you need to. Just want to go through and make sure that we're squared away on this ethics stuff, just because it's incredibly important. Okay. So back to Tuskegee syphilis experiment. So the idea was we need to have, and then there's other stuff in psychology that was sort of highly questionable for a lot of reasons, things that are going on. And so the idea was we need to come up with something that sort of formalizes the rights of research participants, okay? And so what the Belmont report does is outline some basic ethical principles. 3 basic ethical principles. Number 1, respect for persons. Respect for persons involves the belief that individuals should be treated as autonomous, and that individuals with diminished autonomy entitled to some extra protections, okay? So if I'm talking about autonomy, I'm saying that you as a person, Heather, you're in my screen, I'm sort of looking at you. I'm saying that Heather has the right to decide, if I have a study, Heather has the right to decide whether or not she wants to participate in that study or not, okay? And what I'm going to do is on the front end, I'm going to say, hey, Heather, I'm running a study. These are the requirements. This is what's going to happen. This is the time commitment. This is any compensation. Would you like to participate? And if Heather wants to participate, that's cool. If not, that's her choice, right? This is a big, big issue. The main thing that we've got going on with research, and any of the research that you'll participate in this semester, there's going to be some informed consent. This informed consent is just letting you know the risks and potential benefits, what you're going to be doing, time commitment, so that you as your own individual can make an informed choice on whether or not you want to participate or not. Okay. Now, sometimes we have research that involves individuals with a diminished capacity for autonomy. Who might we be talking about with individuals with diminished capacity to make independent choices for themselves?
A child or somebody who's mentally disabled.
Yep. So we got children, or perhaps individuals with intellectual disabilities. Who else?
I like what someone just typed, prisoners.
Yeah, prisoners, active military, right? I don't know if we've got anybody who's current or former military. If you're whoever's in charge of you says that you need to do this, you really don't have the option to say, oh, no, thanks, I'm going to pass on that, right? So any research that would involve military. Also, we don't think about this economically and disadvantaged folks. So, Jonathan, let's say that I'm running a study, or I'll make you do it. You're running the study, right? And you're testing out this new drug, but it's kind of a coin flip on whether or not it's going to kill you or not, right? So it's high risk, right? It'll either make you better or it'll kill you, right? And you want to run research on this. And so what you do is you go into, let's say, a poverty-stricken area and say, hey, if you participate in my study, I'll give you $1,000. Is that coercive?
Highly.
Yeah, very, very coercive, right? Because you're basically, if I'm impoverished, if I have no money, that $1,000 makes a huge amount of difference, right? And so we think about this in terms of wanting to make sure that we're providing people with informed consent, that people know the risks and the potential benefits, and laying that all out on the front end. And if we're working with folks who are not able to fully sort of determine whether or not they want to participate or not, making sure that there are extra protections in place for that. Okay, so this is our respect for persons. We also have our ethical principle of beneficence. This is our obligation to, one, do no harm, and if there is risk, to maximize potential benefits and minimize harm. Okay. If we think about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, there are ways to study the trajectory of syphilis that doesn't involve actively keeping people who are infected with syphilis from getting treatment, right? What that study did was maximize the harm and not minimize the benefits for those individuals. And that's not an ethical thing to do. My area of research, right? So I do trauma research, right? If I said, hey, why don't you come in and I'm interested to see sort of what impact trauma has, and so I'm going to sort of crash you into a wall, into a car or something like that, or sort of like actively sort of expose you to some type of trauma, right? That's would be a violation of my obligation to do no harm, maximize benefits, minimize possible harms. What we need to do is research sometimes comes with risk. Well, one, we want to make sure that that risk is sort of whatever question that we're trying to figure out is worth the risk, and that two, that we're doing everything in our power to reduce the risk to individuals, right? I might have a new drug or something like that, and that drug may come with certain risks. What I need to do is make sure that as these things come up, we're monitoring those, and if anything comes up where you might be in danger, we're going to pull you out of that study right away, right? It's not without risk, but we're doing our best to manage that.
Dr. Clapp?
Yeah.
How would you have designed the Tuskegee experiment to be safer?
Well, this is going to be sort of obviously, like, I can't actively infect people with syphilis, and I can't not treat people. But what I could do is I could go into a community and identify people who do have syphilis, right? And there's going to be some people who maybe have identified symptoms earlier and people who have identified symptoms later, and try and capture those individuals. And then if I do find someone with syphilis, particularly advanced syphilis, and we get a sense for what's going on with these folks, then we need to provide them treatment, right? We need to say, hey, here you go. Let's go through. So you could take that study and actually do a great amount of good just by identifying people who just happen to have had advanced stage syphilis, getting that treated, as opposed to getting everybody and then saying, oh, hey, we're just going to watch and see what happens and actively prevent you from moving forward with stuff. All right. Oh,
question.
Yeah, what's that?
Informing patients and people in studies. If you're informing them, how do you avoid the Hawthorne effect?
Yeah, so, I mean, and there's like, you don't have to tell everybody. If I'm conducting a study, right, and let's say it's the alcohol study on attractiveness that we're doing, I don't have to tell you on the front end, hey, I'm going to give you alcohol or a placebo, and what we're looking at is whether or not you think that people who drink are going to rate people as more attractive. I don't have to tell you all of my hypotheses, because that's not going to, then the study's not going to work, right? But what I do need to tell you is what you'll be doing, how long that's going to take, what the risks and potential benefits are, and then let you decide whether or not you want to participate or not. Okay, so it's always, I'm on our IRB, it's always a thing between, okay, you want to give people enough information so that they can make an informed decision, but obviously you can't tell people everything because then it's going to invalidate all your results.
Is that where the debriefing part of it?
Yeah, high five, Michael, exactly. At the end of it, right? If I've used deception, right, at the end of that alcohol study, I might say, okay, so that thing that sort of actually you got that was tasted like alcohol actually didn't have any alcohol. What we're doing is looking at differences across people who have used alcohol or not in terms of attractiveness. This is what we're doing. This is why it's interesting to us. If you have any questions, here we go. And doing all that on the back end so people know kind of where things are at. Yeah. All right, cool. Don't want to keep it too far over. Thanks for tolerating sort of this, but want to finish up with justice. Okay. Third ethical principle of justice. This is our effort to equally distribute both the benefit and the burden of research across a population. Okay. Our idea here is thinking about fair and equitable treatment in sort of individuals in terms of risks and rewards. So who am I pulling into my study? Who gets treatment, who gets it when, and trying to make sure there's even burden, okay? So let's say I'm running a study, and it's a reading study, and I've got a reading intervention for first grade kids, okay? And I say, okay, I'm going to go through and I'm going to run, and this is an intervention that has the potential to have a big impact on kids reading. But I'm saying I'm the only kids that are going to be eligible are kids from English-speaking homes. What's wrong with that?
You're not helping other groups.
Yeah. I'm taking something that and reading interventions are probably pretty safe, and I'm only delivering it or only looking at it in one specific group. Now, unless I have a very, very good reason for restricting that to this one group, I'm sort of starting to run up against concerns that I might have an issue of a problem with justice here, right? Or let's say I'm looking at impact of some cholesterol medication, but everybody in my trial is just men. So I've just looked at men, right? What's wrong with that?
Your research won't help the opposite gender at all.
Yeah, right. This medication could interact or sort of could work in women differently than men. And so if I find that it works, and this is a big issue in medication research, it works well in white men because that's who the research was conducted on. But how it might interact with other folks outside of that population starts to get kind of questionable, right? And so it's an issue of justice in sort of going through and work out the benefits and burdens and things, right? Or let's say I go through and I run this study, work out all the kinks in a low poverty income population because those are the people who I get on the cheap, and then I have some treatment that I sell for thousands of dollars to super rich people. So all the people who tested it out, who took all the burden in sort of getting this worked out, can't afford the actual thing that was tested out on them. Again, an issue with justice in terms of research ethics. Okay. So again, respect for persons is more confidentiality and protections informed consent and protections for individuals who might have reduced capacity. Beneficence, do no harm. Maximize the benefits, minimize the potential threats, and justice, making sure that everything's spread out evenly. Okay. All right. That takes us through to the end. Make sure that you go through, take a look at the lecture summary, comprehension check slides. I took you about 10 over on this, so thank you for bearing with me. Again, if you need to split, go ahead and do that. But for those of you who have questions, I'm happy to hang on and sort of answer questions that you might have. How are we feeling about this? Good? All right.
I have like an unrelated question, but it's still about psychology.
Okay.
I don't know if it fits exactly with everything we just talked about. But you know, like the Milgram shock experiment?
Uh-huh.
Like, I don't know if that's still able to be done today.
No.
Yeah, I didn't think so. But I had a question about, since it was on authority, like, if you added a self-preservation aspect to it, how drastically it would change. Like, if the person knew that they were going to switch spots with the person they were shocking, and that person was going to shock them, like, would they stop a lot sooner, do you think?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, sure. Because then you have skin in the game. I mean, I would assume that if they were like sort of at the beginning, we'll talk about Milgram a little bit. If on the front end you're like, okay, so when they sort of drew for who was the learner and who was the teacher, right? If you said, okay, for the first half you're going to be the teacher, then you're going to flip things around, that would have impacted people's behavior a great deal.
Yeah, I was wondering, like, does authority or self-preservation, like, which one beats the other? I would assume self-preservation.
Yeah, I think probably saving your own ass is probably, in a lot of cases, going to take the day. But it's an interesting question. And that's the thing. I mean, if you look at, Milgram stuff is problematic for a lot of reasons. I would say that it wasn't as, I would maybe rank that as less bad than the Zimbardo stuff. But I don't know. We'll go through and talk a lot about like some of these foundational studies are really, really tricky from an ethical standpoint in a lot of areas. Other questions about ethics, about design, anything like that?
More on what Colin was saying, I kind of thought, wouldn't the need for the Belmont report be because authority in an experiment is more prevalent rather than self-preservation?
Well,
I mean, if you go back to, like, say, like you were saying, Germany and how all that came about.
Yeah.
I mean, you had people marching to their deaths.
Right. Well, and
of authority. Right?
Yeah. And that's the thing, the power differential, even between us right now. Like, I'm the professor. Like, I get to say what happens and what doesn't happen and things like that, right? And if you come into my lab or sort of you're in a research study of mine, there's this implicit power differential, right, where whoever you're working with is an authority figure. And so what we want to do with our ethics and when we're reviewing studies is making sure that participation isn't coercive, that you sort of are free to discontinue at any time. If at any point in a study you just don't want to continue on, you should be able to split without having a negative impact on sort of your credits or anything like that, right? And so for like the studies that we're going to be doing for this class, if you got halfway through and you're like, I don't like this, it makes me uncomfortable, I no longer want to continue. No one on my end should try and say, oh, it'll be fine, or we're almost done, or that's a non-negotiable. If you say I don't want to go anymore, then we're done. Right. And then it shouldn't be like, oh, I put in it's an hour research study and I put in 45 minutes of time. Be like, well, Jonathan, I guess if you're out, then I can't credit you for the study. Now, if you never show up, right, then that's something different. But wanting to be careful that research isn't coercive, that it protects your privacy, and that we're not asking you to do things that you don't want to do. Now, some of our studies involve stressors and sort of things that are kind of a pain, or it could be emotionally upsetting or things along those lines. If that's the case, need to tell you on the front end that, hey, this is what this is going to involve. This is what you're going to be doing in this study, and then let you decide whether or not you want to participate or not.
I had a question.
Yeah.
I know in the reading it talked about the AP and the BPS were urging different things, and one of the things that they were urging was protecting participants from greater than usual harm and discomfort.
Mm-hmm.
How is that scaled, or is that kind of where you're talking about like the participant themselves can kind of decide what is too much for them?
Yeah, and it starts to get into a tricky thing, and we do this in IRB, right? Like, and sort of what is greater than greater than usual harm. Let's say I have a study that I'm interested in looking at, like emotional responding or something like that. And so I say, all right, Keely, what I'm going to have you come in and do, and for this study, I'm going to have you watch a series of film clips that will have sort of emotional content or something like that. And I show you some clips that are from movies, let's say, that are sad, and some that are happy, and things along those lines, right? Now, is there risk to that? Well, I mean, you could feel happy, or could feel sad, or maybe something just pokes your buttons and you're kind of bummed for the rest of the day or something like that. I don't know. But on the whole, you're not at any greater risk than just sort of moving through your universe and just catching things sort of normally, right? And so we would say that that study is no greater than minimal risk, right? But let's say I'm doing a different study where I'm looking at the impact of, say, exercise on depression, right? And so what I'm doing is I'm going to have you come to the lab and I'm going to have you get on a treadmill and do some high-intensity interval training or something like that, where you're on there, you're getting your blood pressure up, your sort of heart rate up and things along those lines. Now that's greater than minimal risk, because I'm having you come into the lab and do something, engage in an activity that hopefully we're going to go through and do some screening and make sure that you're healthy and that's not going to be harmful, but you could have an unknown condition, and sort of you could have an adverse event. You could trip and fall. There's just lots of stuff that can go through. Hopefully, most of you aren't sort of having to spend a great deal of your day sprinting around at maximum capacity, unless you're in athletics or something like that, right? And so then we're starting to assume greater than minimal risk of things, right? And so that's, again, on the IRB, what we're trying to go through and tease apart and see kind of where folks are at with stuff. Any other questions? Feeling all right? Any questions about quiz, sort of what we've got going on the next couple of days?
Our first quiz is this Wednesday?
Yep, this Wednesday. So, and again, it'll just be the two modules, and then just the stuff that we've gone over in lectures. Keely, did you have anything else?
Nope, you just answered it right there.
Okay, cool.
Will that take place during class time?
Yep, and that'll take place during class time. I'm having nightmares about this, but I'm trying to sort of let people know, like, this will. And the thing is, I mean, trying to minimize opportunities if people were trying to pull something shady or sort of try and sort of circumnavigate and sort of do. This shouldn't be a group work type of thing, but hopefully, I mean, there's 40 questions. You got 50 minutes to do it. Everything will be in different orders and things like that. If people are trying to coordinate, you're going to take more time than you have to do it. You're going to screw yourself over if you're trying to do that, right? And so trying to keep it just so it's fair and even Steven in that time period, but just really, really need to make sure that you got a good internet connection and things along those lines, because if it fails, there's not much we can do about that, right? So I'll just say, okay, cool, you've got a drop. We'll just use that. No worries. You're no farther behind than anybody else. Just sort of want to make sure that you're good. And if there's any concerns about your internet connection, your platform, or anything like that, make sure you get in touch with IT and say, hey, I've got this thing at this time. And so normally we would say, okay, you can go and maybe use a computer lab because that's going to be a solid connection, but we're not supposed to be on campus right now. So just make sure that you sort of think ahead with that stuff.
Are we going to be in Zoom while we test or no?
No. It'll be, so you won't link in. Other classes will have like honor lock and some different stuff. It is just a high burden where you have to have a machine that is able to sort of run the software and the camera, and you have to be sitting in a certain place. I would reserve that type of thing for like really high impact exams. These are quizzes. You need to do well on them, but there's a lot of them. So I'm just going to open it up. You'll go through, link in, run the quiz, and then you're going to be good to go.
So we'll just link in through WIO courses?
Yeah.
Something like that? Okay.
Yep. And I'll go through, I'll get that set up, have it open, and you should see, and I'll take off the lockdown browser restriction on that, so people can just get in, and it'll be open for the period during that class is open, and then we'll shut down at, I don't know, I'll probably leave it open till 11:55 or something like that. Just trying to keep things even Steven across semesters and stuff. Anything else? Cool. All right. Well, thanks everybody for hanging in there. I'll go through and get this posted up. Is that link working on for the that playlist on YouTube? Is that working? Has anybody tried to just navigate to that off of the homepage? Okay.
It worked for me. I went over some parts of the second lecture.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that way you're not having to try and sift through YouTube, try and figure out what's going on, where it should list them all out. So I'll get this posted up so that you have that good to go. Samantha will send out a reminder on the SI session, and then I'll send out an announcement for the review session on Tuesday. So, cool. Good work. Thanks. Let me know if you have any questions on any of the material from lecture or anything from the test. Otherwise, we'll see you maybe Tuesday. All right, folks. We'll see ya.